If you would like to enter the heart of one of the most important personalities of the Americas, if you appreciate existential explorations of mortality, this book is for you. Stay tuned. Welcome to Biblical Cultists. I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. Also, follow me on X. I do put additional things, quotes, and you can communicate with me directly. And check out my merch store if you want to get an item to help the channel out. That would be appreciated. Now in this episode, I'm going over The General in His Labyrinth by Gabriel García Márquez. Now the edition that I have, which is from Vintage Books 2003, I have it in Spanish, but you can get the exact same edition, same cover, everything if you want that, by clicking my Amazon affiliate link, which I'm going to place on the pinned comment. And doing this, no cost to you for clicking it and buying it through the link. It gives a tiny percentage to the channel when you do so I would really appreciate it. And then again, once you go in there, you can get the same edition that I have, an English version if you can't read in Spanish, or find whatever edition works. Again, content is king, so whatever edition you can find of it would work. Now, as a prelude to the book, I just would like to say that Simón Bolívar, which is the main personality explored in this work, is known as the Liberator, a military genius who fought against the Spanish Empire and achieved the independence of many countries in the American hemisphere and has held a permanent impact on its people. And at the time, his fame was worldwide. I mean, you will find Civil War generals in the United States with the name Simón Bolívar, which is very fascinating. So he was a well-known character. You could call him the Napoleon of the Americas, actually, which is interesting because unlike Washington or some other characters in the United States or Canada, they were never really Napoleons of sorts, meaning they were not really conquerors of vast territories and personalities of this type. But the American hemisphere does have a Napoleon if we're going to be a little flexible with that illusion. And that person would be Simón Bolívar. And I would argue also San Martin, who is well known for the liberation of many countries as well in the southern tip of South America. Now, Simón Bolívar's end was quite sad, and his life was complicated due to the amazingly expansive territory that he had liberated. So, knowing a little bit about Simón Bolívar would help you in reading this particular work, but I don't think it's 100% necessary. I'm just saying a preliminary understanding of him and of his life would give you a good perspective when you enter this book. Now, this work in particular is quite close to a historical novel, but it contains the classic elements of magical realism, which is so popular in Latin American novels and invented within that genre. So the veil between the crude realities of life and the emotional incertitudes of existence, the blurring of reality and fantasy are easily crossed in these kinds of works. Although I would clarify, this book in particular is not heavily weighted down by magical realism because of its historical nature, and I think it's the author's way of giving respect to Bolivar. Now, as those who are familiar with the story, Bolivar felt doomed to a sad fate, dying alone, without the love of his people, without recognition and respect. And this tragic weight was more prominent at the end of his life because he was very successful in the middle of his career, but a lot of complications occurred. It made it more difficult for him to feel in any way successful. And he was proven true at the end of his particular life, although his personality, his influence exploded after, so that at the end of the day, he did achieve the recognition that he deserved. And just to give you a feel for the book itself, I'm going to give you an initial quote. It was the end. General Simón José Antonio de la Santísima Trinidad Bolívar y Palacios was leaving forever. He had wrested from Spanish rule an empire 5 times larger than Europe, had led 20 years of war efforts to keep it free and united, and he had governed it with a firm hand until the previous week. But when it came time to leave, he didn't even take with him the consolation of being believed. The only one who was lucid enough to know that he was really leaving and where he was going was the English diplomat who wrote in an official report to his government, quote, "The time he has left will barely be enough to reach his grave." So a few things there that stand out to me is the vast amount of territory. Napoleon never ever controlled and ruled over a territory as vast as the one that Simón Bolívar had. And this is very important because of context. Napoleon moved within a very small area, and I think most people don't realize this because of his fame and reputation. But Simón Bolívar had many times over the territory to liberate and also to rule as generalissimo, as president, as dictator, because he held all these titles in one way or another. So that should give you perspective in their fame and in their ability as generals. And to add to that component there, consider that in these decades of war, Bolívar had ridden on horseback about 18,000 leagues, which equals to about 162,000 square miles, or you could say 103 million acres. That gives you an idea of the space we're discussing here, which is ridiculous. And doing the calculations, the author himself tells you that it's about circumventing the globe 2 times. Now, Bolívar was also an avid reader, and the reason this is interesting for our channel, not only because of the focus of it, but the way he read was fascinating. He read every topic that he could find. He didn't really discriminate between one subject matter to another. Also, because he was always on the move, he didn't really have one single library. He was spread throughout all this territory with book collections that he would leave with friends, and he would have a small library here, another there. But people would say that he was carrying books all the time, and he was stacking them in every corner so that you could see that he was building a library, but it was all scattered throughout the continent. And not only this, but the approach to the book is fascinating. This work actually made me reflect on how you can read people, and I love that expression, based on how they read and how they manage books themselves. Obviously, I am counting those that don't read, because that also tells you something about them. Their lack of introspective power to engage knowledge, the disregard for the magical power and the objects of knowledge, which are the books. I mean, this tells you a lot about a person as well. But I'm speaking about the personality who doesn't have a niche, who reads scattered subjects and enjoys them all in some way or the other, and abandons a book wherever he is at for the sake of mobility. So there is quite a lot you can understand from a person just knowing this about them. Now, it is difficult to speak about Bolivar without speaking about his dream, which was a unified Latin America, a large fatherland, even if the countries within them sustained obviously their identity and their particularities, but it would be a single unified America. But we're speaking about the Spanish-speaking America, and this is important to point out because Bolivar was making a case of a ethno-cultural unity that you find in Latin America that didn't include the Anglo-speaking North American component of the hemisphere. And as a matter of fact, in a lot of ways, Bolivar blamed the United States for trying to block the achievement of this because he felt that the US was threatened by this possibility, and that they have immersed themselves in local politics ever since to keep this from really happening because of the resources and potential of the territory if it were unified to achieve a lot of things. Irrespective of your politics on this, it's still an interesting point. His dream was unity, but the territory is so vast, he found it very difficult. He would say that every time you move north, the south will go into chaos, and every time you move south, the north will go into chaos and civil war and political strife. And that's part of the tragedy, the desire to achieve something that is almost unachievable. And one of the criticisms they've made of Bolivar, especially in Peru, where he is not seen as positively as he is seen in Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia, etc., in which his personality shines brighter than the sun. But in these other areas further south, his imposition of a dictatorial government, and when I say that, I mean classically dictatorial, like Caesar, in which you have a single personality who holds emergency powers and control of the state, was all because of his desire to forcibly unify the people of the Southern Hemisphere. And obviously this created a lot of complications because he is trying to force a unity that most of the people at the time were not, in my opinion, enlightened enough to get. And because of this desire, then he would seem to be quixotic, too loose with his convictions, because in certain areas he would be very flexible, forgive everyone that betrayed him for the sake of unity, and in other cases he would be harsh and aggressive to make sure that unity was preserved. So because his focus was unity, he would constantly appear to hold contrary opinions and morals when it comes to his view of others. And they seem to not really understand that his obsession with unity is the one that created a lot of these insanely strange ideological contrasts. In one aspect, he would be called a Republican, a believer in Enlightenment values of freedom of the press and these kinds of things. But on the other side, he would also say that certain populations cannot live or should live under these values, that traditional monarchical structures are superior. Autocracies are the best way of ruling a country. And some of us would agree with him on that point, whereas others would lean towards the more Republican element of his personality. This is why, even to this day, we find in Latin America those that are far left who tend to put Bolivar right in the center of their ideology, like it happens in Venezuela, for example. But then you can also find right-wingers that would put him in the center by arguing the opposite position. So this gives you an example of how almost all people in Latin America can claim him one way or the other because of these contrary and somewhat tragic aspects of his personality. Before we go, let me go over another quote that I think is relevant. "Don't be afraid," said the general in a calm tone. "Go to Mexico, even if they kill you or even if you die. And go now while you're still young, because one day it will be too late, and then you won't feel like you belong here or there. You'll feel like a stranger everywhere, and that's worse than being dead." Now, I love that quote because of the tragedy and despair that Garcia Marquez is able to place on these pages. It exemplifies the mood. It's not a happy book, but it's a profoundly emotional book that can resonate with people even if you're not familiar with the history. So to finalize, beautifully written introspective on an aspect of life that most people don't like to think about, and how history sometimes can be cruel on you, but sometimes can also be kind at the end of the day. The people will eventually recognize what you've done if what you did was honest and for the sake of others. So he died as if he wasn't anything important, But because of this tragic, almost Christological element to his history, he became larger than life. And I think this is an important reflection on the book because there is a deeply Christian aspect to the work. Because most famous personalities of this region tend to be deeply influenced by the Christological experience, and a lot of times end up fulfilling these dynamics in their own lives. And that connection between the spiritual and the material and history and the transcendental is always fascinating to me and impactful. So hopefully you enjoy the review. Check out the link on the pinned comment if you're interested in helping the channel out. And also, please remember to subscribe to the channel. Click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. I will really appreciate it. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.